Hello and welcome to the Columbia Daily Tribune's Behind the Stripes football webcast. This is Tribune sports editor Joe Walljasper along with Tribune football beat writer David Morrison. David, it's been 2 weeks since we webcasted and it was an eventful 2 weeks to say the least. Missouri upset improbably by Indiana, and then equally, if not more improbably, beats South Carolina on the road, a game which they really looked dead in the water for the entire second half until springing to life in the final 7 minutes. So let's tackle the second game first, because I think that is the one that's freshest on everyone's minds and still kind of something that's being talked about around Missouri. It's a very hard game to evaluate because if you look at the statistics afterward, it would be hard to tell that Missouri won the game. What did you take away from that game, or what did it tell you about Missouri?
The thing it told me most, I think, was this team has some of the resilience that last year's team did, at least some of the resilience that last year's team did. I mean, they, like you said, it just looked as if there was absolutely no chance with 7 minutes to go. You know, they'd gained 60-something yards since the first quarter, and then they're being asked to score 2 touchdowns in 7-16 or however much they had. And then, you know, Maty Mauk hits Bud Sasser for 41 yards, which, by the way, he had passed for 5 yards the entire half before that pass, and all of a sudden they're off to the races. So, I mean, the thing that it taught me the most was that this team is resilient. I guess, you know, all the lip service they pay to positive coaching and staying positive and being, you know, even keel and all that stuff. I mean, I guess it does work, because if they were at each other's throats on the sideline the whole game, I don't think Maty Mauk makes that throw, and I don't think, you know, I think the defense is probably throttling the offense by the end because they're tired of getting stops and getting absolutely nothing in return. So, I mean, I guess this is it's a pretty together team, it seems like, and it's one that can pull off a win like that. And also, I mean, it told me that the defense had a little more in the tank than I thought it did, because the defense played a really, really good game. I mean, they got after Dylan Thompson. The linebackers, Shearer and Brothers especially, were very sound in tackling. And I mean, they, instead of letting South Carolina drive down the field dramatically in the last minute like the Indiana, they knocked 4 straight passes away and just kind of ended it. So, I mean, it taught me a lot about the resiliency, and it taught me a little bit more about the defense, I would say, long story short.
Well, from a practical standpoint, if you punt 10 times in a row, if that somehow becomes the model you try to follow the rest of the year, you're probably going to lose 10 out of 10 times. But that time they didn't. I agree with you. Usually in those kind of games, you see if you're, you know, really you could say they look dead in the water in the fourth quarter. They almost seemed dead at halftime, and they were only losing by 3 points. It just seemed like, I didn't know what the final score was going to be, but I kind of thought Missouri was going to have 7, because it just seemed like, you know, they squandered so much field position in the first half, where they could have had, you know, if nothing else, a few field goals, which would have been big. And then once they kind of started ending up in the losing end of the field position battle of the second half, it was just 3 and out, 3 and out, 3 and out. And the way they were going about it was just like the startling sameness of it all, where Maty Mauk would drop back to pass and nobody would be open, and then he would just take off and they would chase him to the sidelines and he'd be running backwards and throwing it away and lather, rinse, repeat. And it was just, you just didn't see any way out. And so usually in games like that, when you're the team that's losing, at some point the defense does just say enough, and you start giving up big plays. And I kind of thought that maybe was going to start to happen after they give up the touchdown to go down 27. But then, you know, I think that offensive drive by Missouri then perked the defense back up, and they just locked it down for the rest of the game. The game, you know, it's kind of funny. Missouri looked so dead at that point. I don't think anybody in the press box really even questioned, why isn't South Carolina going for 2? It was a very logical time to go for 2. Because a 12-point lead and a 13-point lead was about the same, so they had a chance to go ahead by 14, and Steve Spurrier just forgot, and that turned out to be big as the game wore on. So I think a lot of intangible things you learned about Missouri. The tangible things were maybe more worrisome in some ways. If the offense could be that bad, you know, that was disconcerting. But I guess maybe the question would be then, was the offense that bad because they were down 2 starting receivers and basically were kind of playing with the JV receiving core? They were missing Jimmy Hunt, who I think they hope to have back by the Georgia game, and missing Darius White, who probably is a few weeks away still.
Well, I think that meant some of the dysfunction. I don't think you can blame it all on that. I mean, still they're not getting the push in the run game that we saw last year. I mean, last year they could pretty much dictate the game when they wanted to with their run. Like, it was just something they could count on, and this year they really can. I mean, there were signs of kind of turning a corner against South Carolina. You know, Marcus Murphy had the 22-yard runoff tackle on the last drive to get him into scoring position, and you know, they went to the speed option on 3rd and 10 to get those 9 yards to set up that 4th and 1. So I mean, there were signs of turning a corner in the run game, but it's still just not what it was last year. And then I don't think you can blame a 12 for 34 performance entirely on two people being out. I mean, it seemed like in the South Carolina game last year, Mauk, he was just very jumpy, it seemed like, in the pocket. And even going back and rewatching it, he didn't have to get out as much as he got out, but he did. He just kept, I don't know, spinning and running and doing things that he really didn't feel, or it didn't really feel like he had to do, because the pocket actually held pretty well for him the whole game. So I mean, I think it was just kind of a jumpy, subpar performance from Maty Mauk, but then you do couple that with, you know, well, Wesley Leftwich isn't as good at getting open as Darius White is and Jamon Moore. And, you know, Lawrence Lee isn't as good at reading Maty Mauk's scramble drill as Jimmy Hunt is, things like that. So, I mean, there are some aspects of the game in which the senior receivers obviously would have made it maybe closer to, I don't know, 18 of 34 than 12 of 34, but I think Mauk was just, I don't know if he was inside his own head or maybe out of his mind, one of those two.
There was a few instances where there seemed to be pretty clearly cases of these guys aren't used to working with each other. Like, he would throw a pass and Lawrence Lee just turned his head and suddenly it was hitting him.
Right, yeah. Or
I think there was a situation where Gavinati kind of broke off a route and Maty Mauk threw it deep. And so there was, you know, a handful of those, but yeah, I would sort of agree with your assessment that two receivers can't make that much difference, I don't think. Or if they do, Missouri probably needed to get more committed to running the ball if that was the case, because especially when they did have good field position in the first half, I thought they were a little too prone to passing, knowing that they didn't have the receivers. With all that said, I did think Wesley Leftwich made two pretty big plays in that game. In one of them, he was blocking on the edge for the first touchdown run, and he sustained that block, and I thought it was the difference between just being a decent gain and being a touchdown. And the way the offense was moving, that could have been the difference between 3 and 7 points. Yeah. And then he caught that pass in traffic to set up Missouri's second touchdown, which was not an easy catch, and he fought for some yards to get him down the 1 yard line. So I thought it was good for him. He's a guy that, you know, coming into the season, I don't think anybody really even expected to play much. So good on him.
And a QB too.
And he's a QB, yeah. Maty Mauk, this is a side story, but as we were driving to Charleston, South Carolina, thanks a lot, O'Hare Airport, we heard a lot of people, you know, national commentators talking about the game, and more than one was saying, well, you know, South Carolina has a suspect secondary. We think Maty Mauk's just going to pick them apart because Maty Mauk this and Maty Mauk that. It seems like nationally, analysts maybe seem to be more in love with Maty Mauk than maybe the people who watch him all the time, who are a little bit more confused or conflicted about him. What's your thoughts on that? And maybe, you know, if you have the 14 starting quarterbacks in the SEC, where do you think at this point in his career he would rank amongst that group?
Yeah, coming into the year, I thought he might have been, you know, top 4, kind of up there with, I don't know, Dak Prescott, Bo Wallace, you know, guys like that, Nick Marshall, guys like that. But I think coming into the year, I thought he had a better grasp of diagnosing than it seems like he does now. Like, it seems like unless he's playing a team like Toledo, which is, 1, not good at pass defense to begin with, and 2, missing 2 of its corners for the season with injuries, he doesn't really pick apart secondaries, you know? I don't know, he did a pretty good job against Indiana of when they played back, taking the stuff in front and getting those 7 and 8 yard gains, but other than that, it seems like he sees his first read. If he doesn't like what he sees, then he tries to scramble and run around and hope that somebody gets open. It doesn't seem as if he makes the move from first read to second read in kind of a logical, consistent manner. So I think that's still holding him back. And so I mean, he might still be a top half quarterback in the SEC. I mean, I'd say Blake Sims is obviously having a better year than him. Dak Prescott, Bo Wallace.
Nick Marshall,
yeah, maybe Towles, Kenny Hill, obviously. Maybe the guy at Kentucky's having a better year than him. I'd say him and Dylan Thompson, maybe, you know, they played against each other and neither of them were very good. So, I don't know. I would say he's a little bit further down that list than I thought he was heading into the season.
I'm maybe a little higher on him than you are. I almost would rather have him than Bo Wallace, to tell you the truth. There's something about some of these guys on the list that even though their statistics are going to be better, I may be a little less statistically inclined. There's just something about him that he's got some sort of confidence that might be completely misplaced most of the time, but he still has it. And so, it's hard to, I love James Franklin, but I think at the end of a game where he would have played like Maty Mauk played for 3.5 quarters, I'm not sure James would have had it in him to still, for whatever reason, think he was going to win the game.
Well, we have a case study with that, which is the Cotton Bowl, where James Franklin
played he did
absolutely terribly for 3.5 quarters and then let him back.
There's something about him that things just seem to work out for him in the end, and I don't know if this is just still a small enough sample size where it's all going to turn at some point, or if it's just he's got a little something. But I think what we do see sometimes, though, is I think nationally, when people talk about him, I think a lot of times they're looking at highlights, and that's what they're judging. There's so many college football games out there, and until Saturday, Missouri wasn't playing on one of the featured games. I think you had a lot of people who were looking at his touchdown passes and the highlights, which are usually pretty impressive because he makes some weird plays. But I think if you watch him, the game, you're kind of the more you see, sometimes the more you're conflicted about just what exactly is going on here and why does it keep working.
Yeah, I think one thing that really goes for him, and I don't usually put much credence into leadership and all these sort of things, but I mean the guys are with him. They really are. Like they except for a rogue towel throw here or there, there's no real bickering between him and the wide receivers or anything. And even when there is, it seems like he, gets control of the situation and gets them all pointed in the right direction again. So, I mean, if he's got the whole offense with him and he's making plays, then yeah, I mean, obviously he's gonna be an effective quarterback. It's just like you said, it seems like at least once a game it's just kind of like wow.
Yeah, it's usually more than once a game. Okay, well, the win at South Carolina came on the heels of a game that I don't think any of us really saw coming, and that's losing at home to Indiana. I kind of thought it might be a little bit of a trap game and that you're a little bit, you played the kind of a weak, boring non-conference schedule, which I think at the end of which teams kind of are tired and are ready to play somebody good. And so you got Indiana, who you clobbered last year, and they're coming off a loss to Bowling Green. Had not yet been hammered by Maryland at home. So this is not like a case of Indiana as being way better than we thought. But they were that day, and it was not a fluky win. I thought they just pummeled Missouri at the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball and beat them by 4 points, and it was legit. What did that game, maybe what warning signs did that raise, and was it an isolated incident, or was there things there that I think are troublesome as we look down the line? Yeah,
well, I think you kind of touched on it in your intro there. I think it was both lines of scrimmage were the most troublesome part coming from that game. I mean, obviously, mostly the offensive line, just because that game, Maty Mauk did have reason to scramble because it was always just breaking down. Anytime
Andy had good numbers that game.
Andy had really good numbers that game. But yeah, anytime Indiana brought 4 or 5 guys, it seems like one of them would spring free just immediately, and he'd be running for his life. And then the run game, even though the end numbers ended up being good, I think 110 of the 172 yards came on 2 plays, and they just couldn't get anything else going other than that. And I think that was part of the reason for the switch this week. And I think there were improvements both in pass protection and run blocking, and I think Connor McGovern is a lot better at right guard than he was at right tackle. He wasn't bad at right tackle. I think he's just a huge upgrade at right guard. And Taylor Chappell wasn't a liability at right tackle. So I feel like that's a move that paid off and should continue to pay off if everybody stays healthy and things like that. So I think the line's getting better, but it's still kind of like I was saying earlier, not nearly as good as it was last year with Justin Britt and Max Copeland in there. Probably more for Britt than Copeland, but missing those 2 starters. And then the defensive line, they really didn't get much outside of Shane Ray against Indiana, and it seemed like that's been remedied because there were people breaking through all over the place against South Carolina, and South Carolina is not that bad of a line. So I think
a big remedy was Marcus Golden playing against South Carolina and not playing against Indiana.
Right, but I think the defensive line issues probably were more of an isolated incident, whereas the offensive line has kind of been systemic throughout the season, and it just got really bad against Indiana.
Yeah, I think that I'm kind of a believer in putting your 2 best offensive linemen next to each other. So if you really need to gain, say, a foot on 4th down with the game on the line, you know where you want to go, and that kind of takes some of the guesswork out of it. And I think McGovern moving him to right guard was the wise choice. And if you look at the replay of the 4th and 1 play, it wasn't exactly a fair fight because he and Evan Bain were double teaming that guy, but he was on the proverbial roller skates going back into the end zone, and Connor McGovern ended up about 3 yards deep, wedging out a spot. So I think it's safe to say that was a smart move. It may have been. You can question why he was ever moved to right tackle in the first place, but I think they've got it now. I think they got the best line that they can have now. It's just not a dominant line. I think that's just the way it is. So now, Missouri, the only team in the SEC East not with a loss. So they are in first place in the SEC East. They haven't played nearly as many games as some teams in the East. Who do you think is the favorite now? And where does Missouri fall on the list?
I don't know. I mean, you've got to think that Missouri statistically is the favorite because, like you said, they're first in the league right now, and they've got a win in hand over South Carolina, whereas Georgia doesn't. But I mean, everything can change in 2 weeks when Georgia plays Missouri. Because if Georgia beats Missouri at that point, they're 3-1 in the league. Because I'm assuming they'll beat Vanderbilt. If they don't, then they've obviously got more problems than we think they do. But at that point, Georgia's 3-1 in the league with a win in hand over Missouri. Missouri's got its 1 loss, and South Carolina's already got its 2 losses, and Georgia's really only got Tennessee as its. I'm sorry. I mean, Florida has its other East teams still to play that could possibly challenge them, and Florida isn't.
I don't think Florida's going to challenge either.
So I think maybe in the long run, it's Georgia that's the favorite right now. But I mean, if Missouri can beat Georgia here in 2 weeks, then it's an overwhelming favorite. And I think as we sit right now, maybe they're kind of a slight favorite. But I don't know. I'm not too good at looking into the future.
I think just with the eyeball test, Georgia is the best team. But the fact that they're playing at Missouri, for whatever that's worth, Missouri is really a better road team than a home team anymore the last few years. But in theory, the home field advantage being what it is, and I think Georgia's offense, Missouri is probably a little better suited to stop a traditional pro-style offense and a high-speed spread offense, in my opinion. I think they'll have a lot more trouble with A&M than they do with Georgia. So even though they do have an All-American running back in Todd Gurley, I like their chances against Georgia a little bit at home. It'll be a good game, and if they do win that game, then I think Missouri becomes the favorite. I think all these teams in the East, other than Vanderbilt, which I think is pretty clearly the worst, they're all sort of flawed teams that probably should be ranked somewhere between 20 and 50th in the nation. And so, you can look at a team like Tennessee that gave Georgia a good game, but, they're so weak on the offensive line, you wonder, how long Worley is going to stay upright, and if he goes down, we've all seen Peterman in action, and that's not pretty. So they're a very fragile team. Even though they're so young, they're going to get better. Georgia, I think, is defensively flawed, but they are probably the best talent. South Carolina with 2 losses now is behind the 8 ball, and Florida is just a weird. I think they're in their own heads. I think they're very much like the Michigan of the South, where they should not be so bad, but they are, and I'm not sure it's going to change. And then Kentucky, I think, is maybe not. Everybody was ready to say they're a vastly improved team based on their triple overtime game with Florida. But then beating Vandy just 17-7, maybe they're not quite as improved as we thought. So I think Missouri has the ability to contend. I think they're going to be in a lot of close games. I think some of the games you might have thought they had a clear advantage in before the season, such as Arkansas at home, maybe not so much now. But we shall see. So Missouri's got a bye this week. They'll let some of the other teams beat up on each other. Then they have Georgia coming to town in a big game the following week. So next week we will look ahead to that game, and that's it.